Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Sronen sin houdet you, sound hine breedy fan funt scenes. 30 fine 14, see you harder 30 hours. August 24th, 1942. The night is thick and wet. Salt air drifts inland from the sea. Palm shadows sway over a narrow creek the Marines have named Alligator Creek, though it is truly the Ilu River. On the west bank, men of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, crouch in silence. Sweat runs down their necks beneath steel helmets. Their fingers rest steady on cool metal. Bolts locked. Safety's off. Somewhere out in the dark, frogs and insects hum, masking the faint splashes of something moving across the water. Captain Charles Brush whispers the same order along the line. Hold your fire. Across the sand spit, the Japanese come, fast, confident, in tight waves. Their officers carry samurai swords. Many believe the Americans have already fled. They advance until they can smell oil and gunmetal, until they see the dim glint of barrels pointed their way. Then, the signal flare. The night explodes. Dozens of machine guns open at once, tracing red arcs through palm trunks. The 37 17 teat for a tint. Guns fire canister. Clouds of steel balls tearing through ranks at 40 yards. Within minutes, the entire sandbar becomes a burning wall of noise and shock. In early August 1942, the Pacific War entered a new phase. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Allied forces had seized the initiative. Their target, Guadalcanal, a name few Americans had ever heard before that summer. A jungle-covered island in the southern Solomons, thick with heat, disease, and insects, but holding a strategic prize, an unfinished Japanese airfield near Lunga Point. On August 7th, after days of naval bombardment, the 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, came ashore. The landings were rough but largely unopposed. Within 2 days, Marines secured the airfield and named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. But the Marines' success came with a cost: surprise. Japanese commanders had not expected a large-scale landing here, yet once they realized the threat, they reacted swiftly. The Imperial Japanese Army could not afford to lose Guadalcanal. It threatened their supply lines from Rabaul to the southern Pacific and endangered future operations against New Guinea and Australia. By mid-August, elements of the Japanese 17th Army, under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, began assembling counterattack forces. One of the first units chosen was the Ichiki Detachment, named for its commander, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. Ichiki's unit had originally been part of the Midway invasion force. After that disaster, his troops were reassigned. Elite, confident, and aggressive, trained to assault with speed and close combat. In their minds, the Americans on Guadalcanal were few and disorganized, nothing more than a beachhead garrison that could be driven into the sea. The Marines prepare on the island. However, reality was different. Vandegrift's men, roughly 11,000 strong, were digging in around Henderson Field. They faced shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies, but discipline and determination were solid. Intelligence from coast watchers and reconnaissance patrols warned that Japanese forces were moving along the coast from Taivu Point, east of the Lunga perimeter. The Marines expected an attack, though no one knew when or how strong it would be. Defenses were organized into 3 sectors, with the eastern line, closest to the Ilu River, held by Colonel Clifton B. Cates's 1st Marines. His right flank ended near the mouth of the creek, a small natural bottleneck between the jungle and the sea. It was here that Cates positioned Lieutenant Colonel Leonard B. Cresswell's 1st Battalion and a handful of 37 Sanantridi, 20 mm anti-tank guns supported by machine gun. Crews from the 1st Special Weapons Battalion. Cates's. Orders were simple but precise. Dig in, hold fire until you can see them, and make every shot count. The Marines cleared fields of fire, strung wire, and pre-sighted their guns across the sand spit that formed when the tide ran low. Every approach to the perimeter was registered by artillery. To a casual eye, the defenses looked quiet, even vulnerable. In truth, they were perfectly calibrated for one thing: a night assault. The Japanese march. West, meanwhile, Ichiki landed at Taivu Point on August 19th, with roughly 916 men. About the first echelon of what he believed would be a larger force to follow. Against the advice of his naval counterparts and intelligence officers, Ichiki chose to attack immediately. He believed speed and shock were decisive. His detachment advanced west through the jungle, burdened with ammunition and heavy mortars, but carried almost no food or supplies. Discipline remained high. Morale was absolute. The officers, many veterans of China, saw the campaign as a chance to restore Japanese prestige after Midway's humiliation. By the evening of August 20th, Ichiki's column reached the outskirts of the Marine perimeter. Scouts reported barbed wire and machine gun nests, but Ichiki dismissed the warnings. He was convinced that the Americans numbered only a few hundred, mostly airfield laborers and light troops. He ordered his men to rest briefly, then attack under cover of darkness. The final orders were issued around midnight. "We will sweep the enemy aside in one night." The detachment's leading elements began to form up on the east bank of the Ilu River. Bayonets fixed, grenades ready. The tide was falling, revealing the shallow sandbar that connected both banks. In the darkness, Japanese soldiers crossed quietly, stepping into water that reached their knees. They could see the dim outline of the palm trees across the river. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that hundreds of Marines were already sighting them in, fingers poised, breath held, waiting for the command that would unleash hell itself. The clock was nearing 01:30 on August 21st. The first wave began to move. On the night of August 20th, Guadalcanal was dark and windless. The humid air pressed against the jungle like a wall. In the Marine lines east of Henderson Field, men checked their weapons under the faint glow of red-filtered flashlights. Machine gunners packed fresh belts of .30 caliber rounds. Riflemen dug deeper into their foxholes, the sound of shovels muffled in the damp earth. They had been expecting something for days. Patrols along the Ilu River, or Alligator Creek, had reported distant flashes and echoes of marching boots. Each night the silence felt heavier. Then, near midnight, observers heard movement beyond the wire. Cautious, rhythmic, almost organized, Colonel Clifton B. Cates, commander of the 1st Marines, moved along the line quietly, checking positions. His men were stretched thin, but the discipline was absolute. The order was clear: no one fires until they're across the river. Nearby, Lieutenant John M. Pollock's 37 Bervinsatibin anti-tank guns stood ready behind the sand ridge. Each gun was loaded with canister rounds, lethal shells packed with hundreds of small steel balls, essentially a giant shotgun blast. They had registered every possible crossing point in advance. Sergeant Harry Torgerson, a machine gun section leader, would later recall, "We could hear them talking in Japanese. It was like a low chant. We waited until they were right in front of us." The Japanese begin their assault across the river. Colonel Ichiki divided his detachment into two echelons. The first, roughly 300 men, would storm straight across the sand spit and breach the Marine line. The second, his reserve, would follow after dawn to exploit the breakthrough. Shortly after 01:30 a.m., the leading Japanese troops began to move. Some removed their shirts to fight bare-chested. Others fixed bayonets and advanced in tight ranks. A few carried light machine guns and knee mortars. They believed surprise and aggression would overwhelm the Americans before dawn. But as they crossed the sandbar, the quiet was unnatural. No warning shots, no flares, no shouting, only the sound of water and feet slapping mud. Ichiki's men advanced until they reached the western bank, only 50 meters from the Marine front line. That was when a lone flare hissed into the air. The jungle lit up in white light, revealing hundreds of dark figures caught mid-stride. Then came the roar. Every Marine gun opened at once. From palm to palm, red tracers stitched across the sand spit. The 37mm guns fired canister at point-blank range, turning the open ground into a lethal storm. Within seconds, the Japanese vanguard was shredded. Those who made it to the wire were cut down trying to crawl through. Still, more came. Ichiki, shocked but unrelenting, ordered another assault. Small groups tried to find gaps along the river, but every approach was covered. The Marines had pre-sighted every meter of terrain. Mortar teams dropped shells in tight, rhythmic bursts. Artillery from the rear perimeter joined in, firing 105mm shells into the coconut groves where the second echelon waited. By 03 hours a.m., the battlefield had become a hellish tableau. The river choked with debris and bodies, the palms blazing from tracer fire. The Marines stayed low, conserving ammunition, firing only when a target moved. At dawn, the last organized Japanese wave charged, shouting, "Banzai!" and was annihilated before reaching the wire. By morning light, when the sun rose over the Pacific, a haze of smoke drifted across the lagoon. The Marines were exhausted, their uniforms dark with sweat and powder burns. The smell of cordite and burned vegetation filled the air. Across the river, the scene was almost unreal. Hundreds of Japanese lay sprawled in heaps, many still gripping their rifles, some clutching grenades that had never been thrown. The once quiet sand spit was now a scar of craters, shell fragments, and silence. Colonel Cates ordered reconnaissance patrols forward. They found survivors, wounded or dazed, crawling toward the sea. A few were captured, though most refused to surrender. Cates radioed division headquarters. Enemy force destroyed east of Ilu River. Many dead, area secured, but the battle was not quite over. Scattered pockets of Japanese troops had slipped into the jungle during the night. Some tried to regroup. Others, under Ichiki himself, prepared to make a last stand along the riverbank. Marines from 1st Battalion and Company K. 3rd Battalion began clearing operations, supported by light tanks and artillery. The day was only beginning, and what followed would turn an already devastating defeat into total destruction for Ichiki's command. The battle for Alligator Creek was only hours old, but it had already shifted the psychology of Guadalcanal. The myth of Japanese invincibility was breaking, and the Marines had proven that careful preparation, discipline, and control could outmatch even the most fearless assault. The next phase would be brutal, decisive, and final. What happened on the east bank of the Ilu River was not luck. It was geometry, an engineered trap disguised as a quiet, defensive line. The Marine perimeter had been designed around overlapping fields of fire, anchored on fixed points. The river mouth narrowed the Japanese approach to a corridor barely 100 yards wide, flanked by dense jungle and the ocean. Colonel Clifton B. Cates understood that any attacking force would be funneled directly into this corridor, where machine gun crossfire and pre-sighted artillery could overlap perfectly. To the Japanese, the sandspit looked like a weakness, open, flat, and undefended. To the Marines, it was a perfect ambush field. When the order, "Hold fire," was given, it wasn't restraint. It was timing. Letting the enemy come close meant ensuring every shot counted. At 40 meters, Even the lightest automatic weapon became devastatingly precise. And at that distance, the Marines' 37 Babibivires, they meters canister shells, could destroy entire squads with a single round. The Americans' discipline under pressure, resisting the instinct to fire early, was what made the ambush lethal. When the Japanese crested the sand ridge, the Marines triggered an interlocking semicircle of fire that left no room for retreat. In that geometry lay the key to victory: calculated patience, not blind aggression. Among the most decisive weapons of the battle was the M3 37mm mm anti-tank gun, a light, compact weapon normally used against armored vehicles. But in the jungles of Guadalcanal, it became an instrument of annihilation. Each gun could fire canister ammunition, essentially a large metal shell filled with 122 lead balls, each nearly the size of a marble. When fired, the round burst from the muzzle at 200 feet per second, spreading a cone of steel that shredded anything in front of it within 100 meters. Two such guns covered the mouth of Alligator Creek that night, positioned slightly behind the wire, each with a clear arc across the sand spit. The Marines had marked range stakes in daylight, so gunners could aim even in darkness. When the Japanese came within 50 yards, the first 37mm Tabimitim gun opened up. The effect was instant and horrifying. At such close range, the canister rounds acted like industrial-scale shotguns, cutting through ranks of charging soldiers before they even realized they were under fire. Machine guns and rifles followed, but the canister's psychological effect was unmatched. Survivors of the first wave described the impact as a wall of invisible scythes. Even the thickest palm trunks were chewed to splinters. It was this combination: fire discipline, precise engineering, and adaptable technology that transformed the Marines' static defense into a killing field. The 37mm gun, designed for tanks, had become the perfect anti-personnel weapon of the Pacific. Leadership determined everything that night. Not only the tactics used, but the fate of hundreds of men. Colonel Clifton B. Cates, calm and deliberate, embodied Marine professionalism. He had seen combat in World War I and knew the value of patience. His defense plan for the Lunga perimeter emphasized control under chaos. Use terrain, calculate ranges, and let the enemy come close enough to die in front of your wire. Cates empowered his officers to make immediate tactical decisions, ensuring every sector could operate independently if communications failed. When the Japanese struck, those decisions paid off. Each unit reacted seamlessly, without confusion or panic. Across the river, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki commanded the mirror opposite. A proud officer from Japan's most elite circles, he had fought in China and believed utterly in offensive spirit. Seishin. To him, morale and speed could overcome any defense. Ichiki's arrogance blinded him. He ignored reports of Marine strength and airfield construction. He refused to wait for his full regiment. Worse, he attacked across open terrain at night without artillery preparation, underestimating an enemy he'd never faced before. Where Cates built a defense on realism, Ichiki built an attack on illusion. When the battle began and his first wave vanished in smoke and fire, Ichiki reportedly tried to regroup, but by then the tactical equation had already collapsed. Every Japanese maneuver, flanking, crawling, even swimming along the shore, ran into another layer of pre-sighted Marine fire. Ichiki's fatal flaw wasn't cowardice or incompetence, it was belief. Belief that sheer courage could defy geometry, gunpowder, and discipline. By dawn, that belief had burned away with his detachment. The lessons of that night would echo far beyond Guadalcanal. For the Marines, it was proof that preparation, technology, and leadership could triumph over fanaticism. For Japan, it was the first unmistakable sign that their doctrine of spiritual superiority had met its limit against a modern, disciplined defense. And in the hours that followed, as the sun rose over the river's smoke and ruin, both sides would see, with chilling clarity, the full cost of that collision between willpower and reality. For the Marines, the hardest part wasn't the fight. It was the waiting. In every foxhole that night, men lay in silence for nearly an hour, watching shadows move across the river, hearing the soft splash of boots in water. The instinct to fire was overwhelming, yet not one trigger was pulled until the flare went up. That restraint defined the character of the American defense. Every Marine on the line knew that firing too early would ruin the trap, that silence was deadlier than bullets. It took control, nerves, and trust in leadership. When the shooting began, the release was total. For minutes, the perimeter erupted into a continuous roar, a sensory overload of muzzle flashes, shouting, and exploding grenades. Many Marines fought until their barrels glowed red. But when the noise finally subsided and the searchlights came on, the men saw what their discipline had done. Hundreds of bodies scattered across the sand spit, many barely recognizable. Some Marines were stunned into silence. Others simply stared, smoking quietly, saying nothing. It was victory, yes, but it came with a human weight. The night had proven their courage, yet also exposed the brutal reality of modern war. Survival often depended on how long a man could wait before pulling the trigger. Before Guadalcanal, the Japanese army carried an aura of inevitability. From the Philippines to Singapore, they had swept through Asia with speed and ferocity. Their soldiers were seen, by both sides, as near superhuman in discipline and fearlessness. Colonel Ichiki's detachment embodied that myth. His men were veterans of the China campaigns, trained to attack without hesitation, steeped in the code of Bushido. They had no expectation of defeat, no word for surrender. But at Alligator Creek, reality rewrote that myth in blood. The Japanese charged bravely, there is no denying it, but they charged into a crossfire they couldn't comprehend. Their light weapons were useless against the dug-in Marines. Their mortars had little effect on reinforced positions. Their officers, leading from the front with swords drawn, were cut down before they reached the wire. By dawn, communication had collapsed. Runners sent back for reinforcements were killed in the river. Those who survived were ordered by Ichiki to regroup. But regroup into what? Half their strength was gone in the first hour. When daylight came and Marine tanks rolled forward, the remaining Japanese resisted with desperation, firing until ammunition ran out, then attacking with bayonets or grenades clutched to their chests. Many fell beside their flags. In the aftermath, the Americans buried over 770 Japanese bodies. Only 15 prisoners were taken alive. The Ichiki detachment, once a symbol of Japan's proud offensive power, ceased to exist as an organized unit. The myth of invincibility was not just broken, it was burned into the sand of the Ilu River. War teaches lessons not written in manuals. One of them is this: the closer you let the enemy come, the less it feels like strategy, and the more it feels like murder. The Marines who fought that night spoke afterward about the eerie intimacy of the killing. Many engagements happened within 10 meters, close enough to see expressions, to hear shouts in another language. One Marine later told a reporter, "They just kept coming. We couldn't believe it. They were brave, crazy brave, and we had to keep firing until there wasn't anyone left." That mixture of awe and horror defined Guadalcanal's first great land battle. The Marines didn't hate their enemies, they respected them, even feared them, but they had no choice but to destroy them. For the Japanese, the moral code was equally rigid. To die attacking was honor. To retreat was shame. Many soldiers crawled forward even while wounded, pulling grenades under their bodies to explode among the living. The brutality wasn't cruelty. It was doctrine. Two armies bound by different moral worlds colliding at point-blank range. When it ended, both sides had changed. The Marines understood that the Pacific War would not be won by technology alone. The Japanese learned that courage without coordination was suicide. That moral shift, from faith in spirit to reliance on reality, began here, on this small strip of riverbank. The night at Alligator Creek was more than a single victory. It was an early laboratory for a new kind of war. Jungle, amphibious, and psychological. The Japanese fought with doctrine inherited from the Russo-Japanese War. Speed, shock, and bayonet charge. The Marines fought with adaptation, combining old trench warfare discipline with modern combined arms coordination. After the battle, Marine officers studied every aspect of the defense. The placement of 37 mm guns, the timing of artillery, even the depth of foxholes. Many of these lessons would be written directly into the Marine Corps' 1943 training manuals for island warfare. For the Japanese Army, the defeat forced internal reflection. Future operations on Guadalcanal, at Edson's Ridge, Matanikau, and Henderson Field would be better coordinated. But never again would Japanese commanders underestimate the Marines so completely. What began as a night skirmish had become the first blueprint of American island defense doctrine, one that would echo from Tarawa to Iwo Jima. As the sun climbed higher on August 21st, the battle lines were quiet. Smoke rose over the wreckage of coconut palms. The Marines reloaded, refilled canteens, and looked toward the horizon, knowing more was coming. Because Guadalcanal wasn't over. It had only just begun. The enemy was regrouping. The seas to the north churned with reinforcements. And soon, the next Japanese offensive would strike. But for now, in that brief silence, the men of the 1st Marine Division had proven a truth that would define the Pacific War. Victory did not belong to the fastest, nor to the boldest, but to those who could wait, watch, and strike when the moment was absolute. The sky over the Solomon Sea was beginning to pale when the last wave of the Ichiki detachment hurled itself into the Marine line. It was 4:30 a.m., August 21st, 1942. The moon had dipped below the palms, leaving the sandbar dimly silver under the stars. The tide was low again, exposing the slick curve of the river mouth. The same stretch of ground already littered with hundreds of bodies. From behind the wire, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard B. Cresswell's 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, held steady. The previous hours had been a blur of sound. The rhythmic hammer of .30 caliber Brownings, the sharp bark of Springfields, and the concussive thunder of 37 mm guns firing canister after canister into the dark. But now, amid the smoke and steam, came an eerie quiet, broken only by the low moans of wounded men across the creek. Through that haze, movement stirred again. Dozens of Japanese soldiers, stripped to the waist and caked in river mud, crept forward clutching rifles and grenades. Behind them, officers shouted in harsh bursts, rallying what remained of the first echelon. Colonel Ichiki himself stood back near a palm grove, saber in hand, directing fire. His eyes were red with exhaustion, but his will was unbroken. He had lost nearly half his force, yet he still believed the enemy could be pushed back, that a concentrated final charge could pierce the perimeter and seize Henderson Field before daylight exposed his weakness. At 0440, Ichiki gave the order. Flares arced over the sandbar, turning night into a sickly white glare. Bugles sounded, thin, defiant notes over the roar of the surf. The survivors rose and charged. From the Marine side came the answering storm. Every gun that could fire, fired. Tracers sliced the mist in red and green arcs. The 37mm crews switched to armor-piercing rounds when their canister ran low, punching holes through logs and men alike. Japanese troops reached the barbed wire, hacking with bayonets and wire cutters, only to be cut down by machine gun bursts at 5 yards. Grenades rolled back and forth across the mud, exploding with muffled thuds. Sergeant Harry Torgerson's section fought until its gun jammed from heat, then used captured Japanese light machine guns to keep the line alive. Corporal Jim McAuliffe, his face burned by powder, fired a rifle until the bolt seized, then picked up another. Within 15 minutes, the sandspit was a chaos of muzzle flashes, screams, and smoke. The Japanese momentum died there, crushed against a wall of lead and steel. As dawn brightened over the coconut trees, Colonel Cates recognized the moment. Through binoculars, he saw the enemy line falter. He ordered the 1st Tank Platoon, light M3 Stuarts, forward to clear the eastern bank. At 06:30, the tanks clattered through the shallow water, engines whining, treads grinding over wreckage. Behind them, advanced riflemen from Company K, bayonets fixed. The scene was apocalyptic. The air stank of burnt powder and flesh. The sand was blackened and cratered. The tanks moved deliberately, spraying machine gun fire into the thickets where movement flickered. Each burst sent up fountains of dirt and fragments of uniform. Japanese soldiers who had taken refuge among the palms tried to resist, throwing grenades at the tracks, but they were too few. Some rose to charge and were cut down instantly. Others crawled toward the tanks with explosives, tied to poles. The first hint of tactics that would later define Japan's desperate defenses. But the Marines shot them before they got close. By 08:02, the Stuarts had crossed the river entirely. The counterattack rolled east along the beach, sweeping the remnants of Ichiki's force before it. The Japanese cohesion shattered. Groups of 10 or 20 fled into the jungle, pursued by Marine rifle fire. Colonel Ichiki refused to retreat. With about 100 men remaining, he established a defensive circle near a grove of palms 400 yards east of the river, his regimental flag planted upright beside him. There, surrounded by smoke and the dead, he prepared to die as he had lived, on the offensive. At 09:30, Marine tanks and infantry surrounded the position. Artillery from Battery C, 11th Marines began shelling from the west, while mortars dropped rounds from the perimeter line. The Japanese fought until ammunition was gone. When the firing stopped, Marines moved in cautiously. They found Colonel Ichiki seated against a tree, his pistol still in hand, a small ceremonial sword at his side. He had shot himself rather than surrender. Beside him lay the shredded remains of the Ichiki Detachment's battle flag, the same banner that had once led victories across China. By late morning, the battle was over. The riverbank was silent again, except for the crackle of burning palms and the distant hum of aircraft taking off from Henderson Field. Reporters and staff officers arriving later would describe the area as a slaughter ground. Over 770 Japanese bodies were counted. The rest had fled or drowned. Only 15 prisoners were taken, many too wounded to speak. Marine losses stood at 41 killed and about 70 wounded. A grim toll, but infinitesimal compared to the enemy's annihilation. The name Alligator Creek would be etched forever into Marine lore. For the Japanese, it would become synonymous with disaster. That morning, when Vandegrift received Cates's radio message, "The enemy has been repulsed. Situation in hand." He understood the magnitude of what had happened. The first major Japanese ground assault of the Pacific War had been destroyed. But even as the Marines secured their lines, reconnaissance reports hinted at something ominous. More Japanese ships gathering at Rabaul. Reinforcements were coming. Guadalcanal's first victory was only the opening chapter of a longer, bloodier struggle. The battle was won. But the war for the island had just begun. The sun stood high above Guadalcanal by noon on August 21st, 1942. The tropical haze shimmered over the battlefield, thick with smoke and the sweet, sick smell of decay. The Marines had secured the area east of the Ilu River, but now they faced the grim duty of understanding what they had just survived, and what it meant. The river, once a lazy tidal stream, was clogged with wreckage. Helmets floated among palm fronds. Rifles lay twisted, their wood blackened by fire. Corpses, hundreds of them, lay sprawled across the sand spit and shallows, tangled in barbed wire, or stacked against the riverbank where they had tried to cross. In the water, the current carried blood downstream toward the sea. It was here that a Marine patrol coined the phrase that would echo through reports. Alligator Creek ran red that morning. Nearby, Navy photographers stepped carefully between the bodies, documenting what few Allied officers had ever seen before: the complete destruction of a Japanese infantry detachment. While the photographers worked, Colonel Cates issued orders for mopping up operations east of the river. Lieutenant Colonel Cresswell's battalion advanced cautiously through the coconut groves, backed by tanks and machine guns. Every few yards, snipers opened fire from concealed pits or tree lines, the last remnants of Ichiki's shattered command refusing to yield. At 11:30, one of the tanks hit a buried Japanese ammunition dump. The explosion ripped open the grove, scattering debris and forcing the infantry to pull back temporarily. When the smoke cleared, they pressed on, burning any bunkers they found. By 13 foot, organized resistance had ended. The surviving Japanese, fewer than 30, had either been killed or captured. Most refused to speak. A few muttered that Colonel Ichiki was dead and that they had failed their emperor. Cates ordered the entire area policed. The Marines collected documents, maps, and diaries from the fallen. Rare intelligence treasures. In them, translators later found notes showing Ichiki's confidence before the attack. Enemy believed to be weak. Operation will be swift. Field secured before sunrise. That single line, written in firm brush strokes, would later be displayed at headquarters as proof of how deadly overconfidence could be. Back near Henderson Field, word of the victory spread quickly. Exhausted Marines dragged themselves to shade, cleaned their weapons, and ate their first real meal in 24 hours. Mess lines were quiet. No one cheered. Most men just stared at the horizon, trying to process the scale of what had happened. When General Alexander A. Vandegrift visited the front that afternoon, he found soldiers sitting along the bank, staring at the river. Many were too tired to stand. He said nothing for a long time, then quietly remarked to an aide, "They have learned their trade." The remark wasn't prideful. It was somber. The Marines had fought their first major ground battle of the Pacific Campaign and won, but the victory revealed the nature of the war ahead: relentless, close, and unforgiving. News of Ichiki's annihilation reached Rabaul 3 days later. The reaction among Japanese command staff was disbelief, then anger. Colonel Ichiki had been one of their most promising officers, a veteran of elite units, personally respected by senior generals. Reports from survivors painted a grim picture. No artillery support, no reconnaissance, no coordination with naval forces. Hyakutaga's 17th Army realized, too late, that they had underestimated the American foothold. Within weeks, new plans were drawn for a much larger counteroffensive: to land thousands of troops along the northern coast, surround the Marines, and crush Henderson Field. But in Tokyo, the loss of the Ichiki detachment was considered a humiliation. Propaganda papers barely mentioned it, calling it a minor skirmish. Officially, Ichiki's name was preserved in honor. Unofficially, his failure became a warning whispered in command circles. For the Allies, Alligator Creek was more than a tactical win. It was the first psychological break in the Pacific War. Until that moment, Allied troops everywhere, from Singapore to Bataan, had seen Japanese soldiers as nearly unstoppable. They fought ferociously, died willingly, and rarely surrendered. The Marine victory shattered that myth. It proved the Japanese could be beaten, not by luck, but by discipline, preparation, and coordinated firepower. Radio Tokyo denounced the reports as American lies, but word filtered through to other Japanese units, dampening morale. Officers began to question the wisdom of frontal charges and nighttime bayonet assaults against fortified positions. For the Marines, confidence soared. They now knew they could hold their own against Japan's best. Yet, with that confidence came grim acceptance. This enemy would never quit. Every inch of the Pacific would have to be taken at a price. As night fell again on August 21st, the sky turned amber and purple over the island. Henderson Field's engineers worked through the evening, repairing the runway, while Cates's men buried the dead in mass graves east of the river. A group of chaplains read a brief service, their voices drowned by the drone of aircraft warming up. One Marine recalled later, "It was the quietest sunset I ever saw. Nobody talked. We just watched the river glow." In the distance, aircraft engines roared as Cactus Air Force planes took off to Tutun, patrol the coast, a sign that the Marines' tenuous grip on Guadalcanal was holding. The Battle of the Ardefi'i, Tanaru, as history would later call it, had ended in total victory. But every man who survived that night understood something fundamental. The Japanese would be back, stronger, angrier, and better prepared. The real fight for Guadalcanal, and for the Pacific, had only begun. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the pause between storms, the thin breath before the next wave of war would sweep across the island. The Marines had survived by waiting until the enemy was too close. Now, they would have to survive an entire campaign that refused to end. When the smoke cleared and the last gunfire faded, the Marines of Guadalcanal stood amid a vision of total ruin. Alligator Creek, once a quiet ribbon of water through the palms, was now a mass grave. The surface shimmered with spent cartridges and drifting helmets. The sand spit where the Japanese had charged gleamed metallic with shell casings and twisted bayonets. Marine engineers and medical corpsmen moved through the wreckage, collecting weapons, ammunition, and anything of intelligence value. But more than anything, they collected bodies. Over 770 Japanese soldiers were counted. Most had fallen within 50 yards of the Marine line, a testament to how close they had come before dying. Some lay in the wire. Others were frozen mid-run, their rifles still clutched tight. The odor of death carried across the river, mingling with the diesel smoke of the tanks and the salt wind off the sea. The Marines buried their own dead separately. 41 Americans had been killed and roughly 70 wounded, mostly from grenade fragments and sniper fire. Compared to the enemy losses, the casualty ratio was staggering, nearly 20-1. But for those who survived, the numbers meant little. Every man had a friend who didn't come back. The Battle of the Tenaru, though small in scale, marked a historic first. It was the first clear ground victory for American forces against the Imperial Japanese Army. In the months before, nearly every Allied garrison in the Pacific had fallen. The headlines had been a litany of retreat: Wake Island, Bataan, Singapore. The myth of the invincible Japanese soldier had weighed heavily on every Allied mind. Guadalcanal changed that narrative overnight. Reports from the front stunned American newspapers. The Marine Corps had stood its ground and destroyed an entire Japanese battalion in one night. Across the Pacific, morale shifted. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt received Vandegrift's initial dispatch with simple satisfaction. "Well done, hold what you have." The Japanese, for their part, could hardly believe it. At Rabaul, when the first survivors of Ichiki's unit stumbled in days later, starved, wounded, and delirious, staff officers realized the scale of the disaster. The Ichiki detachment had ceased to exist. For Tokyo, the loss was both strategic and spiritual. The Imperial Army had been humiliated by what it saw as an inferior opponent, a force it had expected to sweep aside. Tactically, the battle secured the eastern flank of the Lunga perimeter. The Marines' position around Henderson Field, still under constant air attack, was now safer from immediate ground assault. Cates's regiment strengthened its defenses, laying deeper trenches, more wire, and establishing a permanent outpost on the east bank of the Ilu. But strategically, the consequences went far beyond Guadalcanal. The destruction of Ichiki's force convinced Japanese high command that the Marines' presence was far more serious than first assumed. It triggered a chain of desperate countermeasures, reinforcements from Rabaul, nightly naval bombardments, and the arrival of the Kawaguchi detachment, which would launch the bloody assault later known as Bloody Ridge. What had begun as a minor mopping-up operation had now turned into a full-scale campaign. The U.S. Navy, still recovering from losses at Savo Island earlier that month, understood the new stakes. Admiral Richmond K. Turner and Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher redoubled efforts to protect marine supply lines. For the first time, the Japanese were reacting to American initiative, not the other way around. Guadalcanal had become the pivot point of the Pacific. War correspondents arriving after the battle were struck by two things: the discipline of the Marines and the ferocity of the Japanese dead. Photographs taken that week showed piles of rifles stacked like timber, and the haunting image of a Japanese soldier frozen mid-charge. One journalist wrote in his notes, "You could see courage on both sides." The difference was calculation. For the young Marines who had survived, that night would stay with them for life. Some would describe it decades later with the same words: "They came too close, and we had to stop them." The victory at Alligator Creek was the first heartbeat of a longer struggle, proof that America could win, but also a warning of how much that victory would cost. The day after the fighting ended, Guadalcanal seemed unnaturally quiet. The jungle, burned black in patches, hissed with steam as the first rains of the season fell. Marines rested in silence, rifles across their laps, staring at the ground as if still expecting movement. Behind them, Henderson Field rumbled to life, the faint throb of engines signaling that the island's lifeline, the Cactus Air Force, was still operational. For the first time since landing, the men of the 1st Marine Division understood what it meant to hold a piece of ground in the Pacific. It wasn't just about surviving an attack, it was about enduring everything that came after: the heat, the disease, the isolation, and the knowledge that the enemy would return. The battle at Alligator Creek forced the U.S. military to rethink its understanding of combat in the Pacific. The Army and Navy had anticipated conventional engagements, defined lines, daylight battles, and retreat when outnumbered. Guadalcanal showed that the Japanese would fight by night, close, and with suicidal determination. American training manuals began to change almost immediately. The Marine Corps compiled detailed reports from Cates's and Creswell's battalions, analyzing everything from field-of-fire preparation to night discipline. These became the first formal guidelines for perimeter defense and jungle warfare, later distributed across the Pacific. The lessons were stark. Fire control was more powerful than firepower itself. Prepared positions, not aggression, won in the jungle. Close-range ambush could break the strongest assault. The doctrine of hold until too close, then annihilate, became the unofficial mantra of Guadalcanal. Charitines, the psychological effect on both sides was immense. For the Americans, Tenaru was a spark of hope, proof that the Japanese could bleed, break, and lose. For Japan, it was a quiet crisis. In Tokyo, the War Ministry issued no public announcement of the loss. Newspapers mentioned only local resistance near the Lunga airfield. Yet within the officer corps, word spread quickly. The enemy had destroyed an elite detachment in a single night. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, once a rising star, became both a cautionary tale and a martyr. In posthumous reports, his actions were reframed as heroic self-sacrifice, preserving the image of invincible Japanese spirit. But behind the rhetoric, his defeat forced painful internal debate. Could spiritual resolve alone overcome modern American fire coordination? Among younger officers, doubts began to form. Quiet, unspoken doubts that would grow as the campaign dragged on. Meanwhile, for the Marines, victory brought little relief. Supply shortages grew worse. Malaria and dysentery spread through the ranks. Japanese aircraft bombed the airfield daily. Every night, destroyers, soon nicknamed the Tokyo Express, slipped down the slot between islands, shelling the perimeter and landing new troops. Colonel Cates's men rotated between foxholes and burial details, strengthening the eastern sector even as they battled exhaustion. They knew another assault was coming. It did. In September, the Kawaguchi Brigade, 3 times the size of Ichiki's force, launched a massive attack against the ridge south of Henderson Field. The Marines held again, but barely. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, as it became known, owed its victory to the same principles learned at Alligator Creek: preparation, patience, and fire control under chaos. Tenaru had been the test. Bloody Ridge was the proof. When historians later looked back on Guadalcanal, they would see the Battle of the Tenaru not as an isolated clash, but as the moment when 2 military cultures truly met, one relying on speed and spirit, the other on coordination and calculation. It was here that the United States Marine Corps forged the combat identity it would carry through every Pacific island. Aggressive when needed, but unshakably disciplined when waiting, and it was here that Japan first glimpsed the edge of its coming decline, so the realization that courage alone could not win an industrial war. As one Marine veteran put it years later, they came thinking we'd run. We stayed, we waited, and we fired when it mattered. That philosophy, patient, relentless, and precise, would echo from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. The creek would be renamed officially as the Ilu River, but to every man who had been there, it would forever remain Alligator Creek, the place where the tide of war began to turn. At dawn on August 22, 1942, the smoke still hung low over the palms. The sea rolled quietly against the shore, indifferent to what had happened there. The Marines, weary and hollow-eyed, cleaned their weapons and dug deeper trenches, knowing the calm would not last. But beneath the exhaustion, something irreversible had changed. The Battle of the Tenaru, the first true land clash between the United States and Imperial Japan, had lasted less than 12 hours. Yet its consequences would echo for years. It was more than a tactical victory. It was the moment the illusion of Japanese invincibility began to crack. The Marines had proven that precision, preparation, and control could defeat fanaticism and speed. They had held their fire until the enemy was too close, and, in doing so, revealed a truth about modern war. Restraint, not fury, often decides survival. The Japanese, for their part, learned a different lesson. Courage without reconnaissance is blindness. Spirit without adaptation is suicide. The empire that had stormed Asia by faith and ferocity had met an opponent who could match its resolve and outthink it. In that sense, Alligator Creek was not only a victory for the Marines, it was a warning to the world that the Pacific War would not be won by willpower alone. It would be won by endurance, by those who could wait in the dark, measure the moment, and strike when the line between fear and discipline vanished. In the months that followed, battles across the Pacific, Edson's Ridge, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, would all carry the same echo: the lesson of the creek. The war still had years to run, but on that humid August night, amid the smoke, the tracers, and the whispered order, "Hold fire," the United States Marine Corps found its identity. And as the engines of Henderson Field roared to life and lifted into the morning sky, the men below knew it. Guadalcanal would not fall. The tide had turned.